Captain Evelyn Carter arrived at Gate 43 exactly 20 minutes before boarding began, as she always did. No rushing, no wasted movement. Her navy blue uniform was pressed flat, her wings polished but not flashy. To most people passing by, she looked like any other experienced airline captain professional, quiet, forgettable. And that was exactly how she preferred it. Flight 718 was scheduled for a routine cross-country run, one of those flights pilots barely remembered once it was over. Clear skies were forecast across most of the route. No storms, no turbulence worth mentioning. Just another long silver tube carrying 236 people from one side of America to the other. Families with tired kids clustered near the windows. Business travelers scrolled through emails they'd already read twice. A young couple argued softly about seats. An elderly man stared at the aircraft outside like it was something alive. None of them looked toward the cockpit door. Inside, Evelyn ran her pre-flight checks with methodical calm. Fuel levels, weather updates, engine performance data. Her first officer, younger and sharp, followed along, occasionally glancing at her with quiet respect. She had that effect on people, steady, reassuring, unshakable. "Looks like an easy one," he said, trying to sound relaxed. Evelyn nodded. "They're the ones that matter most." He smiled, not fully understanding what she meant. As boarding began, Evelyn remained seated, eyes scanning instrument panels rather than passengers. She had learned long ago that comfort bred carelessness, and carelessness cost lives. Experience didn't mean relaxing, it meant staying ready. While the cabin filled, a flight attendant peeked into the cockpit. "Full load today, Captain." 236. Evelyn acknowledged it with a nod. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened for just a moment. Numbers always mattered to her. Every single one. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway, the sun dipped low over the terminal, casting long shadows across the tarmac. To passengers, it was a beautiful sight. To Evelyn, it was just another variable wind angle, visibility, glare. The engines roared to life. Takeoff was smooth, textbook perfect. The aircraft lifted into the sky like it had done thousands of times before, climbing steadily above cities, rivers, and roads, shrinking into lines below. At cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign clicked off. The cabin relaxed. Drinks were served. Laughter returned. Evelyn didn't relax. She adjusted her headset and reviewed alternate airports in her head, not because she expected trouble, but because she never assumed safety. Her past had taught her one lesson above all others. The sky doesn't warn you. It only tests you. At 35,000 feet, the aircraft leveled out. Instruments glowed green. The engine readings were perfect until they weren't. A single amber light flickered for less than a second. The first officer didn't notice it. Evelyn did. Her eyes locked onto the panel, pupils narrowing. She leaned in slightly, watching, waiting. The light disappeared. The engine continued humming smoothly. Most pilots would have dismissed it. A sensor glitch. Nothing more. Evelyn memorized its position anyway. Minutes passed. The Midwest stretched endlessly beneath them, flat and calm, broken only by distant clouds that looked harmless enough. Then it happened. A thunderous bang tore through the aircraft like an explosion inside its bones. The plane lurched violently to the left. In the cabin, screams erupted. Overhead bins rattled. Somewhere, glass shattered. Up front, warning alarms screamed to life, red lights flashing like a battlefield flare. The first officer's breath caught in his throat. Evelyn Carter didn't flinch. Her hands moved instantly, not fast, not slow, but exact. Years of discipline, of pressure, of moments where hesitation meant death, surged forward without conscious thought. "One engine failure," she said, voice steady, grounded. "I have control." As the aircraft began to lose power, 236 lives unknowingly crossed an invisible line. This flight was no longer routine. And the woman no one noticed was about to prove why she never needed to be. The cabin erupted in confusion, before fear fully set in. Passengers felt the aircraft jerk sideways, their bodies thrown against armrests as gravity briefly betrayed them. A child screamed. Someone dropped a phone that slid across the aisle. Overhead bins rattled like they might burst open at any moment. Then came the sound that terrified everyone, most not the bang, but the silence that followed. One of the engines no longer roared. In the cockpit, warning alarms overlapped in a chaotic chorus. Red indicators flashed across the panel. Engine pressure 0. Temperature spiking. The smell of hot metal seeped faintly into the air. The first officer swallowed hard. Training kicked in, but fear followed close behind. His hands hovered for a split second longer than they should have. Evelyn noticed. "Eyes on me," she said calmly, not raising her voice. "We're flying the airplane." Those 4 words snapped him back. His posture straightened. He nodded. Evelyn countered the yaw with controlled rudder input, her movements precise enough to stabilize the aircraft before it could spiral. The jet shuddered but obeyed. The plane wanted to fall. She refused to let it. "Confirm engine 1 failure," she said. The first officer scanned the panel, fingers moving faster now. "Confirmed. Complete loss of thrust." Evelyn nodded once. No surprise. No anger. Just acceptance. She reached for the engine cutoff, pausing just long enough to verify, triple-checking instinctively. A wrong move here could ignite a fire or tear the engine apart. Then she shut it down. The alarm softened but didn't disappear. The aircraft continued flying, heavy and unbalanced, supported now by a single engine doing the work of 2. Air traffic control broke in, tension sharp in the controller's voice. "Flight 718, radar shows abnormal deviation." "Confirm status." Evelyn pressed the transmit button. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." "Flight 718, we've lost 1 engine and are maintaining control." Her voice never cracked. On the ground, the word mayday triggered a silent chain reaction. Emergency protocols activated. Runways were evaluated. Fire crews prepared. Phones rang. Back in the cabin, the flight attendants struggled to keep order. Some passengers clutched armrests. Others stared straight ahead, frozen. A man whispered prayers under his breath. A woman held her child so tightly the kid began to cry again. And still no explanation. Evelyn focused on airspeed, altitude, and heading. The plane was stable, but only because she forced it to be. One mistake, too steep, too slow, too aggressive, and gravity would take over. "Near a suitable airport?" she asked. The first officer rattled off options, his voice steadier now. "We've got one about 18 minutes out. Long runway. Weather is acceptable." Evelyn weighed it instantly. Terrain, wind, fuel, population density below. "We're taking it," she said. "Advise a TC." As the aircraft began its gradual descent, turbulence rattled the fuselage, reminding everyone how fragile metal was at this altitude. Evelyn finally reached for the intercom. The cabin fell silent as her voice came through, calm and grounded, like someone explaining a minor delay rather than a life-threatening emergency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. We've experienced a mechanical issue with one of our engines. The aircraft is designed to fly safely on one engine, and we are fully in control. We'll be diverting to an alternate airport as a precaution." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Our crew is trained for this situation. Please remain seated and follow all instructions from the flight attendants. No panic. No apologies. Just confidence." Some passengers later said that was the moment they stopped imagining the worst. In the cockpit, the first officer stole a glance at her. "You've done this before?" he said quietly. Evelyn didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the horizon, jaw set, mind already several steps ahead. She wasn't thinking about fear. She wasn't thinking about headlines or passengers or even herself. She was thinking about survival. Because somewhere deep inside her, this situation felt disturbingly familiar. And far above them, unseen and unannounced, radar systems began tracking Flight 718 with growing interest. The sky was watching now. The plane drifted through the thin, high-altitude air, listing slightly to the left where the failed engine once roared. Inside the cabin, tension built like static electricity. Every bump, every unfamiliar sound made hearts race. Passengers whispered hurried prayers, clutched hands, and held children close. Some stared out the windows, expecting disaster in the horizon, while others simply closed their eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But in the cockpit, Captain Evelyn Carter was almost serene. Her hands moved over the controls with precision that bordered on artistic. She compensated for yaw-adjusted trim and fine-tuned throttle all with the quiet confidence of someone who had flown in situations far worse than this. Every movement was instinctual, almost subconscious, honed by years of intense training in conditions no civilian pilot would ever face. The first officer watched, wide-eyed. "I've never seen anyone handle a single-engine situation like this in real life," he admitted quietly. His voice barely rose above the hum of the remaining engine. Evelyn didn't respond. Her focus was total. Her eyes scanned every dial and instrument, calculating angles, monitoring engine temperature, and adjusting for weight distribution. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to panic. Every decision had been drilled into her muscle memory over countless flights, tests, and simulations. She spoke into the intercom again, her voice calm and measured. "Cabin crew, please ensure passengers remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Prepare the cabin for emergency procedures." Her tone had no urgency, yet it carried an authority that compelled compliance. Flight attendants moved swiftly, guiding passengers into a state of controlled obedience. Outside, the sky was deceptively peaceful. The sun cast long golden rays across the wing, making it look as if the plane were gliding effortlessly. But inside, the reality was far different. One engine meant the aircraft's performance was halved. Maneuvering options were limited. Fuel calculations were critical. Weather conditions, though mild, had to be constantly monitored. One wrong move could send the plane into an unrecoverable spin. Evelyn calculated the glide path, factoring in weight, wind, and altitude. She had 18 minutes to bring the aircraft to a safe landing. In that short time, every micro-adjustment mattered. Every input on the yoke, every nudge of the rudder, every slight correction of throttle could be the difference between life and death. Her hands flew over the controls, but her expression remained calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. To an outsider, she might have seemed almost detached, but in reality, she was hyper-focused, every sense heightened. Every thought dedicated to one objective: get everyone down alive. The first officer finally spoke again, his voice steadier now. "Captain, you're incredible. How are you so calm?" Evelyn glanced at him briefly, her expression softening for a moment. "Calm comes from preparation. Fear is wasted energy if you're trained to handle it." He swallowed, nodding. "I guess I have a lot to learn." Evelyn allowed herself a fleeting thought of the past memories that had been buried for years. Flying high-performance jets under extreme conditions. Simulations where a single error meant failure. Tests that pushed both body and mind to the absolute limit. Every flight in her past had prepared her for this exact moment. But she didn't dwell on it. Memories were tools, not crutches. Her attention returned to the present. The aircraft was stable on one engine, but it wasn't safe yet. She began her calculated descent, adjusting each control with minute precision. Every passenger on board was unaware of just how close they were to danger. From their perspective, the plane was lurching slightly, a bit shaky, but it wasn't terrifying. That was deliberate. Evelyn had mastered the art of controlled calm. Fear had to be managed, not erased. Minutes passed. The plane descended steadily, perfectly aligned with the calculated approach path. Sweat beaded on the first officer's forehead. He monitored her every move, realizing that the level of control Evelyn had was beyond ordinary training. She wasn't just a commercial pilot today, she was a master of the sky. Finally, Evelyn picked up the radio again. Speaking to air traffic control with the same composure she had displayed from the first alarm. "Flight 718, maintaining control. We are on a single-engine approach to the nearest airport. Request emergency runway clearance. Her calmness wasn't just for the crew or the control tower, it radiated throughout the aircraft. Passengers instinctively quieted, trusting the voice of the woman they had never noticed. The woman now guiding them through a situation no one had ever imagined. This was more than skill. It was experience, courage, and instinct combined. And she was just getting started. The plane now hung in a delicate balance between survival and disaster. Every movement, every adjustment mattered. Outside the cabin, the sun glinted off the wings, making it look serene, almost magical, but inside, the truth was far from peaceful. One engine failure transformed the massive aircraft into a high-stakes puzzle. The plane was heavier on one side, its controls unpredictable, and each adjustment required extreme precision. Passengers began to notice that something wasn't right. The cabin tilted slightly to the left. Drinks wobbled in cups, and a low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some held hands, gripping armrests as if holding onto them would somehow anchor the plane. Others whispered prayers, while a few stared at the ceiling, pretending not to notice. Fear was thick, almost tangible. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, keeping calm, guiding people back into their seats, checking seatbelts. They had trained for emergencies, but this was far beyond any drill. Their eyes occasionally flicked toward the cockpit door, searching for reassurance. And the reassurance was there, hidden in the calm, decisive tone of their captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are maintaining control," Evelyn said. "Please remain seated. You are safe with us." It wasn't false reassurance. She truly meant it. Every calculation, every tiny adjustment on the yoke, every subtle pressure on the throttle was keeping them alive. She had done the math thousands of times in her head: fuel burn, glide ratio, airspeed, distance to runway. Nothing had been left to chance. In the cockpit, the first officer could barely keep up. "I can't believe how steady she is," he murmured. "The plane should be shaking more." Evelyn didn't answer. She was monitoring every variable, mentally preparing for worst-case scenarios while executing the most improbable flight path with a grace that seemed impossible for a plane of that size. She angled the aircraft slightly, compensating for wind gusts, then corrected for minor turbulence. Each adjustment kept the aircraft level enough to prevent a catastrophic stall. Time slowed. 18 minutes became an eternity. Every second counted. Every passenger's life was dependent on her next move. She adjusted speed to maximize lift, controlling the descent rate carefully. One miscalculation and the aircraft could have dropped too, quickly or stalled altogether. Passengers were now fully aware something extraordinary was happening. Phones were quietly recording, eyes were wide, and a collective tension gripped the cabin. Some whispered nervously, "Is she really going to make it?" Others clutched loved ones, silently begging for safety. Evelyn ignored the panic around her. She had no time for fear, not now. She was focused on physics, aerodynamics, and instinct. Years of experience with high-performance jets allowed her to feel the plane's movements almost as if it were alive. She anticipated shifts in wind and weight, corrected angles before they became dangerous, and maintained a delicate balance that no simulator could ever replicate. Minutes passed. She visualized the runway in her mind, calculating the glide path perfectly. Each adjustment, subtle but precise, kept the aircraft on course. The passengers, unaware of how close they were to disaster, began to settle slightly, trusting the calm voice of the captain. The first officer finally spoke, voice almost in awe. "Captain, you're making this look easy?" Evelyn allowed herself a faint smile. "Easy? Hardly. Just controlled?" Outside, the Midwest stretched endlessly, towns and farmland becoming a mosaic of green and gold below. Every mile closer to the runway was a mile closer to safety. The plane continued its steady descent, carefully maintained, as though guided by invisible hands, and somewhere far above, radar systems began noting Flight 718's unusual approach. The precision, the steadiness, the control, it wasn't ordinary. Whoever was flying that plane wasn't just experienced. They were extraordinary. Inside, passengers whispered to one another, wondering silently about the calm voice guiding them. They had no idea that their survival depended on a woman whose past was as secretive as it was extraordinary. A woman who had trained for situations far beyond the imagination of anyone on board. For Evelyn Carter, this was just another flight, except this time the stakes had never been higher. One engine, 236 lives, and the unspoken truth that her training, her instincts, and her courage would determine whether this story ended in tragedy or miracle. The airport came into view like a distant promise. From 35,000 feet, it looked deceptively small. A simple ribbon of asphalt stretching across the flat Midwest landscape. But for Captain Evelyn Carter, every detail mattered. The runway length, crosswinds, approach angles, even the subtle gusts bouncing off nearby buildings. One miscalculation now, and the miracle she had maintained for 18 minutes would vanish in an instant. Inside the cabin, the passengers had grown quiet. Some gripped seatbelts as if holding on tighter could somehow influence the outcome. Children clung to parents. Phones were held ready not to capture the view outside, but in case they needed to record the end of the world. Sweat glistened on foreheads, and the tension was so thick it seemed like it could choke anyone daring to breathe. The flight attendants moved down the aisles again, checking belts and reassuring passengers with calm smiles. Their training kept them steady, but even they couldn't hide the awe forming in their minds. They had never seen a pilot perform so flawlessly under such pressure. In the cockpit, Evelyn's hands moved almost invisibly. She monitored airspeed, adjusting throttles and rudder, calculating lift and drag down to the last fraction. Her mind raced through calculations she didn't even have time to voice aloud, but every input was exact, precise, and intentional. This was no longer about flying a plane, it was about defying physics. "Runway in sight," the first officer said, voice tight with tension. "We've got clear approach." Evelyn didn't respond verbally. She merely nodded, eyes locked on the runway. Every adjustment, every correction, every micro-turn was executed with the calm efficiency of someone who had flown in far worse conditions. Military jets, combat simulations, impossible maneuvers, it all came flooding back to her. But she didn't dwell on the past. She used it silently and effectively. The runway grew larger in the windshield, stretching out like a lifeline. Evelyn began the final descent, carefully managing speed and angle. The plane wobbled slightly on approach, a reminder that the aircraft was carrying 236 lives on a single engine, but her corrections were imperceptible to the untrained eye. Passengers sensed the tension rising again. "We're landing?" Someone whispered. A child cried softly. A woman clasped her hands together, murmuring a prayer. The intercom remained silent now, and the stillness added to the suspense. In the control tower, air traffic controllers held their breath. They had tracked the aircraft all the way down, marveling at the level of control exhibited. No civilian pilot had ever brought a plane this large to a single-engine landing with such precision. The radio crackled as Evelyn's voice finally came through. "Flight 718 on final approach. Maintaining control, will be on the runway in moments. Thank you for your assistance." Her tone was calm, steady, almost ordinary, but anyone listening closely could hear the authority, the command behind it. The runway lights reflected off the wings as the plane neared the asphalt. Evelyn eased the throttles, lowered the landing gear, and adjusted flaps with flawless timing. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the main wheels kissed the runway. One engine. 236 lives. Not a single panic-stricken action. Emergency crews lined the runway, prepared for fire or destruction. Instead, the plane rolled smoothly along the asphalt. Fire trucks braked to a halt as the captain taxied to a safe stop. Silence descended for a heartbeat, then the passengers erupted. Tears, screams, sobs, laughter, they didn't know how to process what had just happened. They had expected disaster and received a miracle instead. The first officer finally exhaled audibly, leaning back in his seat. I don't even know what to say." Evelyn Carter simply unbuckled, her expression calm. She had done what needed to be done. The plane had landed. Everyone was alive, and in her mind that was all that mattered. Somewhere high above, unnoticed by the passengers or emergency crews, Two F-22 Raptors observed the landing. Their pilots had been tracking the jet from the moment the engine failed. Now they radioed to each other in disbelief. "Whoever's flying that, she's not civilian trained," one said. "She's got skills I haven't seen outside a fighter jet," the other replied. The control tower couldn't believe it either. This was more than a landing, it was a demonstration of mastery under pressure that bordered on impossible. And as passengers slowly disembarked, still trembling and hugging strangers, no one yet knew the secret behind the calm, commanding woman who had saved 236 lives in a way that no civilian pilot should have been able to do. Captain Evelyn Carter walked down the aisle quietly, almost invisible, her mission complete. The miracle had occurred. But the real story, her past, her training, her history was yet to be revealed. Far above the Midwest, two F-22 Raptors sliced through the sky, their sleek forms almost invisible against the soft blue of the afternoon. The fighter pilots had been redirected toward Flight 718 the moment the emergency was declared. Their mission: observe, escort if necessary, and ensure the airliner didn't stray into restricted airspace. But as they approached, both pilots realized that what they were witnessing was something extraordinary. The airliner was steady, almost impossibly steady. One pilot, calcined Viper, tightened his grip on the controls. "Check this out," he said, pointing to the jet on the HUD. "She's flying perfectly on one engine." The other, Ghost, didn't respond immediately. His eyes widened, scanning the approach. "That's not normal," he said finally. "Look at her descent. She's compensating for wind, weight, everything, with the precision of a combat-trained pilot." They had seen thousands of emergency landings in their careers, most of them messy, some deadly. They had trained in simulators for extreme conditions, and yet nothing prepared them for this. Every micro-movement of Flight 718 suggested experience beyond civilian training, almost like the pilot was performing a controlled aerobatic maneuver in a passenger jet. Viper radioed the observation back to command. "This is Viper, the civilian aircraft approaching the main runway. She's handling it like a fighter jet. I repeat, fighter jet. All passengers are alive, but her precision. It's extraordinary." Back in the cockpit, Evelyn Carter remained focused on the runway below. She had noticed the jets only peripherally, aware that military traffic was monitoring but not interfering. Their presence didn't distract her. If anything, it reminded her that the stakes were higher than she had imagined. The Raptors flanked the airliner, one on either side. They mirrored its movements, carefully observing the angles and adjustments. Ghost spoke softly into the mic, almost in awe. "I can't believe this. Whoever's flying that, she knows exactly what she's doing. Every micro adjustment, rudder, throttle, trim. It's like watching a Top Gun maneuver in a passenger jet." Viper nodded, his jaw tight. No civilian pilot could manage that. "This is someone with combat training, fighter training. She's elite." They studied her as the airliner neared the runway. Every calculation, every adjustment, every subtle movement was precise. Even from their vantage, they could see the extraordinary skill at work, the way the plane seemed almost to glide, balancing on a knife's edge of aerodynamics. Meanwhile, on the ground, emergency crews were still preparing for impact. They had expected chaos, fire, smoke, anything, but the plane remained steady, controlled, almost graceful. Tower personnel exchanged glances, incredulous at the calm authority the airliner exuded, unaware that two of the most elite fighter pilots in the world were witnessing the same scene and whispering the same thoughts. Ghost spoke again, barely audible over the radio. "Viper, I think we need to know who she is. This isn't just skill. This is a lifetime of training condensed into 18 minutes of flight." Viper shook his head. "And she's doing it without even flinching. Look at her hands, how steady they are. Look at her approach angle, she's calculating every factor. She's Top Gun level." The words hung in the cockpit like a revelation. It wasn't just admiration they were recognizing. A secret world of elite aviation expertise hidden behind the calm face of a commercial pilot. Evelyn continued her descent, unaware of the quiet awe she inspired in the jets above. The runway approached, stretching out like a lifeline, and the plane responded to every subtle control input perfectly. She wasn't fighting the aircraft. She was working with it, guiding it with precision honed over years of extreme training. The Raptors followed as she touched down. Viper's voice was tight with disbelief. That was perfect on one engine. Unbelievable. Whoever she is, she's no ordinary pilot, Ghost added quietly. And she doesn't even know we're watching. She's just flying. From high above, the two jets silently recorded every movement, knowing that history had just unfolded before their eyes. The passengers on Flight 718 had no idea that their safe landing was not just a miracle, it was a testament to the skills of a pilot trained to fly fighter jets, someone whose past had prepared her for exactly this impossible moment. And in the cockpit of Flight 718, Evelyn Carter remained calm, focused, and unaware that the world above had already begun whispering her secret. Hours after the miraculous landing, Flight 718 was parked safely at the gate. Passengers were still shaking, hugging strangers, and whispering to flight attendants about the miracle they had just survived. Yet, none of them had any idea of the story behind the calm, composed captain who had guided them safely to the ground. Evelyn Carter walked down the aisle quietly, collecting her things, exchanging polite nods with crew members, and offering gentle reassurances to passengers. She had saved 236 lives, yet for her, it was simply part of the job. Meanwhile, high above the airport, the two F-22 pilots who had tracked the flight were on the radio again. Their excitement could no longer be contained. "Viper to command," called one, voice tight with disbelief. "We just observed an emergency landing. On a single engine. The pilot executed it flawlessly. This is beyond civilian skill. We suspect she has advanced fighter training." The request for a debrief went through quickly. Security and aviation authorities needed to meet the pilot to confirm the extraordinary skills displayed. But when Evelyn stepped out of the cockpit, she was calm, professional, and completely unassuming. Anyone watching would have thought she was just another airline captain. It wasn't until she met the pilots face to face that the full truth began to surface. Viper studied her closely. "Captain Carter," he said carefully, "we need to know your background. How did you fly that aircraft like that? That landing, it shouldn't have been possible for a civilian pilot." Evelyn allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. She had anticipated this question. For years, she had carefully hidden her past. The civilian world was orderly, safe, predictable. None of it required the extreme skills she had honed in her earlier life. But today, the skill she had buried deep inside her had saved lives. "I was a military pilot," she said quietly. "Fighter jets. High-performance aircraft. Top-level training." The pilots exchanged looks of stunned recognition. Ghost's jaw tightened. "Top Gun level?" he asked almost incredulously. Evelyn nodded. "You could say that. I trained for years in extreme conditions. What you saw this isn't something you can teach in civilian schools. It's instinct, experience, and discipline combined." For a moment, silence fell. The pilots could hardly believe what they were hearing. It all made sense now, the precise maneuvers, the way she handled the aircraft under extreme stress, the calm, unflappable demeanor. Every detail of her landing pointed to someone who had operated at the edge of human ability in the air. Authorities began to gather around, asking questions, taking notes, marveling at what had just occurred. Aviation experts described the landing as once in a generation and miraculous. And yet, Evelyn remained composed, downplaying her role. She spoke only of preparation, training, and teamwork. She never mentioned heroism, never sought attention, never let anyone see the depth of her capability. The media would later write headlines praising her bravery. Passengers would share stories of her calm voice and steady hands. But the pilots, the ones who had observed her from the sky, knew the full truth. Evelyn Carter had taken skills meant for the most elite military aviators and applied them to save hundreds of lives in the civilian world. She had flown fighter jets and simulated dogfights, executed maneuvers at impossible G-forces, and mastered aircraft that demanded every ounce of skill and courage. Yet now she had applied that expertise to a commercial airliner. In a real emergency, with 236 innocent lives on the line. Despite the accolades and amazement around her, Evelyn simply returned to work the next day. She never sought fame. She didn't want interviews or recognition. For her, saving lives was part of the job, whether in a military jet or a passenger aircraft. The secret of her past remained hers, known only to a few and perhaps now. The two F-22 pilots who could finally appreciate just how extraordinary her skill truly was. What the world saw as a miracle landing was, in truth, a demonstration of decades of dedication, discipline, and elite training. Evelyn Carter didn't just save 236 passengers, she had proven that the quietest, most unassuming people sometimes possess the power to perform the impossible when it matters most. And somewhere above the skies she had just tamed, the F-22 pilots watched silently, marveling at the woman who had just rewritten the rules of what a pilot could do. The days following the landing were surreal. News of Flight 718's miraculous touchdown spread like wildfire. Headlines proclaimed a miracle landing. Heroic captain saves 236 lives, and pilot defies the impossible. Social media exploded with awestruck passengers sharing photos, videos, and personal accounts. Some passengers wept as they recounted their survival. Others searched frantically for any trace of the calm voice that had guided them through terror. And yet, Evelyn Carter remained completely herself, quiet, composed, invisible in the midst of the chaos she had survived. She never sought interviews or praise. She didn't appear in photos. She declined offers to speak on television. To Evelyn, it wasn't a story about fame. It wasn't a story about heroism. It was a story about doing what needed to be done. Flight 718's emergency landing became a case study in aviation schools, a subject of analysis for pilots around the world. Experts pored over video footage, flight data, and eyewitness accounts. The precision of her approach, the perfect handling of the aircraft on a single engine, the calmness in the cockpit, it all defied conventional understanding of civilian piloting. Every aviation professional who studied the event came to the same conclusion. This was no ordinary pilot. And that was the truth. Evelyn's calm authority, her precise control, and her split-second decision-making were honed over years in high-performance military aircraft. She had been trained in maneuvers that few pilots could ever imagine, in exercises where one mistake meant failure or death. She had faced impossible situations countless times, and that experience had silently carried her through the most dangerous 18 minutes of Flight 718's history. Even the two F-22 pilots who had followed her from the moment the emergency was declared marveled at what they had seen. They had observed something truly extraordinary: civilian flying executed with the skill and instinct of elite combat aviators. They knew what the public didn't, that the calm, unassuming captain behind the controls had lived a life few could dream of, and now that life had saved hundreds of others. Passengers who had survived the flight called her a miracle worker, a hero, a guardian angel. They remembered her calm voice, her composed demeanor, and the way she seemed to have complete control over a plane that had been crippled by failure. Many wrote letters, sent flowers, and left gifts at the airline offices. Yet Evelyn accepted none of it. She thanked the crew quietly, nodded politely to passengers, and returned to her duties without fanfare. For Evelyn, heroism wasn't about recognition, it was about responsibility. The lives of 236 people had been in her hands, and she had done what she was trained to do. Her satisfaction came not from applause, but from knowing that she had succeeded when it mattered most. In the aviation world, however, her reputation quietly spread. Among pilots, flight instructors, and even military personnel, Evelyn Carter became a legend. Not because she sought fame, but because her actions proved the impossible was possible. Her story became an inspiration, a lesson in discipline, courage, and preparation. The pilot who had saved 236 lives in a passenger jet became an example of what could be achieved when skill and composure intersected under pressure. And somewhere in the background of all the attention, Evelyn returned to the skies. She boarded her next flight, greeted her crew, and performed her pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision she always had. She was the same woman, calm and composed, invisible to the world, yet quietly extraordinary. For the passengers of Flight 718, she would always be remembered as the pilot who saved them. For aviation experts, she was a miracle of technique and skill. And for Evelyn Carter herself, she remained simply a professional doing what she had been trained to do, saving lives, one flight at a time. As the sun set over the Midwest, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evelyn looked out of the cockpit window. The sky had tested her. She had passed. And while the world may never fully understand the life she had lived and the skills she had mastered, one thing was certain: she had flown the impossible. And she had lived to see every passenger walk away safely. The world saw a hero. Evelyn saw her job completed. And the sky remembered her,